I'm not sure how many of you folks read the ANC's January 8th statement. That's the African National Congress. It's an important statement because the president of the country, who's the president of the ANC, gets to outline what are some of the priorities on the policy side that he's thinking about. And on the agricultural sector, he did actually speak about something that is at the core of the growth of our sector, both on ensuring the inclusivity aspect of our sector, but also the expansion, making sure that we are able to get new growth or additional growth in the sector. And that statement was about his commitment to the land reform process in South Africa. And he said the statements that, look, going forward, he wants to ensure that the land reform gains some momentum in South African agriculture without outlining so much about how that will come about. And I think that's correct because, of course, the details of how the policy agenda, the continuous implementation of land reform will be, that is a job of the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development. They have to be assisting on making sure that all of those wishes of the president are carried out appropriately on that. But I think the core thing was the continuous commitment on ensuring that land reform in South Africa accelerate. And I know that many people that followed the land reform conversation in South Africa, especially of late, it get muddled up with all of the things regarding expropriation and all of those aspects. But I'll tell you this, land reform in South Africa remains on market-based principle. That is the willing buyer, willing seller approach. And it still continues fundamentally on those three pillars that we know, which is the land restitution, the land redistribution, and the land tenure. And of course, redistribution, simply put, it looks into ensuring that there is a fair access to land among South Africans. Restitution, you can claim if you're sure that, okay, your folks owned a certain piece of land at some point and they were dispossessed, and there's a whole process that follows that. Restitution is about ensuring that we strengthen the land rights of South Africans. Now, in all of these pillars, over the years, there's been some progress, but of course not at the desired level. In the work of myself, Johan Borman, and Professor Johan Kirstein, we think that the land acquisition or the land reform progress so far, it's somewhere at about 25%. And you remember that the ANC in 1994, they have said that in the first few years when they came into government, they will move and get to 30% of land reform, and that target was continuously moved. Now we are looking at 2030, but the point is that there is some progress, although not at a desired pace. But that's not what the president was talking about. And in fact, the detail of how exactly are we getting to that 30% is all in our online articles, which many people and the followers of AGRIVIEW can pretty much just Google, and you will be able to find the articles that refer to the calculations of how we get to that 25%. But that's not the core conversation of today. The core conversation of today is about how can we then ensure that land reform, not only the aspect of inclusivity, but also additional growth, where will that come from? I think that we have been focused so much as South Africa, correctly, on doing that, on land acquisition, where the state goes out and is buying all of the land, and of course for the purposes of land reform. But where we have not paid sufficient attention is on ensuring that is that land distributed and distributed fairly and distributed with title deeds. And I'm talking about title deeds here because if you are talking about strengthening land rights, you are speaking to ensuring that there is some strong tenure on those that actually get to access that land. And I think that should be perhaps one of our starting points this time around. The reason for that is because the South African government, as I've said on various occasions, sits with about 2.5 million hectares of land. Now, we're a big country, around 122 million hectares, and people may be thinking, is 2.5 million hectares big? And I think in an agricultural perspective, it's quite substantial. Because think about it. In all of the grains and the oilseeds that I typically talk about, we plant them in South Africa, at least summer grains, on about 4.5 million hectares. Now, if I'm saying there's 2.5 million hectares, that's more than half of that. And of course, not all of this land is for crops and vegetables. Some of it is for livestock. But the point is that this land put into agricultural use, productively can deliver extra inch of growth. And I think that the starting point now should be about how do we distribute this land and distribute it effectively. Because let's face it, in 2025, we did not hear a lot from the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development. And to an extent, this is understandable. Because think about it, they were still being separated from the Department of Agriculture, and they were busy with those processes of separating the departments. And one of the things that we heard from them is when they were proposing new legislation and all of those aspects. That is all good and well, but it leads to more discussions than actually delivery to people. And I'll tell you this, many South Africans that I talk to and run into in various farmers' days, they want to see actions. People say they are fed up about meetings. I mean, they're not necessarily meaning meetings are meaningless. Meetings are necessary because planning, communication, and all things happen in those meetings. But what they essentially mean is that they don't want never-ending meetings. They want to see at least some delivery. And I think that to gain momentum, we should start with that 2.5. Where is this 2.5 million hectares? This 2.5 million hectares is under the Department of Agriculture on the agricultural land holding account. And yes, there may be some people occupying other pieces of land, but others, they're probably underutilized. And I think the key thing now is about distributing that land to appropriately selected beneficiaries with title deeds. So how should we be selecting these appropriate beneficiaries? And I think there's a piece of legislation that guides us into that, the beneficiary selection criteria. That is something that came out of the Land Reform Panel of 2018, outlining how should we be selecting people for land redistribution. And of course, in that, there's a greater priority for young people and women who have been sidelined to a certain extent since 1994 on the land reform aspects. And then it prioritizes them, but it then goes into detail as to what are some of the training and the necessary aspects of doing this. And I think that that's an important thing. And another line that was in that ANC's January 8th statement that the president outlined, he said, look, we need to also ensure that there are mechanisms of supporting those that are in the land reform, the beneficiaries of land reform, which means the post-transfer support system. And I think those post-transfer support system could be linked to blended finance, could be linked to schemes that could be set up with organized agriculture, agribusinesses, on ensuring that once the land is transferred, there is a financing, there is a training, there is a route to connecting those beneficiaries to market, which is why then that this process should not only be done by the government, but it should be done by the government, organized agriculture, and the commodity associations, and making sure that it also aligns broadly with the policies of this country and programs like the master plan and all of those programs, because they seek to grow the South African agricultural sector. But I think starting with that 2.5 million hectares of land will give us momentum. I'm not saying land reform should be limited to that. It certainly shouldn't be, but it's a starting point to give us a bit of a momentum where we can see the results, we can see the sector growing, we can also see the inclusivity aspect that many people talk about. So the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development, that's what they should be zooming in a lot this time around. And of course, coming up with elegant ways of how we can do this and do it effectively while engaging all of the stakeholders. And I think if we do that, we will actually be delivering exactly to those points that the president had outlined. And I think many South Africans will agree that that should be the starting point to growing the sector. But beyond that, then, I think that the land reform should continue, but continue on a market-based principles where we still protect the property rights. Because, I mean, we have an agricultural sector that is highly, highly financialized, and you do want the new beneficiaries to also benefit economically. Because land reform is not just about the transfer of land. It is also about the issue of economic growth, making sure that people's lives are better. And people's lives will be better if there are investments. Investments will come if there are strong property rights, and people know that if they invest in a certain pieces of land in future, they will be rewarded for those investments. And I think this is why then this whole aspect is so important. So when people talk about expropriation and confuse it with land reform, those, while even the political leaders, let's agree, there are some in various parties that conflate these things. But But I think that we must be very careful on making sure that the land reform in South Africa still runs on market-based principle. And this is what must be protected, because it is for the good of those that are in the sector, but also those that are yet to join the agricultural sector. But folks, this is a starting point that I think we should start on. And then once we gain momentum, we continue then acquiring more land in the market and coming up with a whole range of instruments that can assist in making sure that we deliver to this land reform process in South Africa. And with that, let me also thank the folks that actually help us to put this show together. And with their support, we're able to deliver this message and have these conversations that I think are important for us as South Africans. And that is Nedbank, who supported this episode. And if you are watching this for the first time, make sure that you subscribe, because every Thursday we'll release new episodes. Thanks for watching.